Hello, everyone. We are back and ready to go for How to Do the Right Thing, Ethics in Community Action. This webinar is being presented by the Community Action Partnership through our Risk Mitigation TNTA Center. You will notice that it's part of a kind of mini-series of webinars that are all happening now in September 2015. So today we are covering ethics, and then you will see some follow-up webinars on specifically conflict of interest and on whistleblower policies. So encourage you, if you're listening to the live, there's still time to sign up for the September 14th and the September 21st webinars for some additional information. And if you're watching this on the recording, encourage you, if you have questions in those areas, to look up the recordings for those as well. So with that, we're going to hand it over to today's presenter, Melanie Herman, who is with the Nonprofit Risk Management Center. She is the guru on nonprofit risk and the brains behind our online risk assessment and policy builder tool that hopefully you are familiar with. You have seen us demonstrate on multiple occasions. So with no further ado, Melanie, take it away.
Thank you so much, Cashin. I'm not seeing the slides currently. I'm just wondering if I need to click on a tab to get that to display on my end.
It would be the one that says how to do up the top.
Perfect. Got it. Thank you so much. With all the rehearsals, sometimes you've got to make one more click to make it happen. Welcome, everyone, and thanks so much for joining me today to talk about ethics in community action agencies. I think this is a great topic. It's certainly related to risk, which is my favorite topic, of course. And we have a couple of scenarios to go over, some dilemmas to talk about, and quite a few slides to get through. So let's just go ahead and get started. This slide, number 2, just has a short overview of the webinar, what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk about ethical challenges. We're going to talk about managing ethical dilemmas, and we'll also look at what I'm calling an ethics filter and talk about how to apply that to the decisions that each of us has to make in our leadership roles in various organizations. Slide number 3 has an overview of the agenda, so you can see the 4 major topics we're going to cover, and I just want to break the first one down into some component parts. So we're going to start by talking about what is ethics, and I want to touch on comparing the topic of compliance versus ethics and how they differ. I also want to talk about ethics and culture and reputation risk. And then I want to turn our attention to the idea that maybe younger workers or more recent workers in our organizations may have a different perspective on ethical decisions and ethical conduct than those long-standing or even older workers. And then we'll share some examples of what we call organization-wide misconduct. Then we'll turn our attention to some of the common ethical challenges facing community action leaders. And we'll go through a series of 4 dilemmas, and we will use that polling feature to find out how you feel about the right path in response to those scenarios. So we'll look at 4 different scenarios, and they're quite a bit different. And of course, none of them are easy. There are none that have an easy answer. And then we'll talk about the ethics filter, which I mentioned, a few pieces to it, and I've also suggested one way to approach an ethics filter and then added some additional complexity, some additional questions to make it even more challenging. And then we'll close with, how do I avoid ethical blunders and mishaps in my leadership role in a community action agency? So those are the topics we're going to cover today. We're going to start with the definition of ethics, and I thought we'd get started with a poll and take our first poll. We're going to look at 3 possible definitions of the word ethics, and you'll see that in the right-hand corner on your screen. And I want to find out which definition resonates with the group on the call today, participating in today's webinar. So go ahead and choose the option that, in your view, best defines the word ethics. So the choices are moral principles that govern a person's or group's behavior. The second choice is the decisions, choices, and actions that reflect our values. And the third choice is standards of conduct that guide decisions and actions based on duties derived from core values. So 3 different definitions of ethics. Let's see how you vote. In another 10 seconds or so to place your vote. We'll see how this first poll turned out.
Great, and many of you have gotten started. There's just a few seconds left, and then we will be able to share your results in the aggregate form, so don't worry, no names are going to appear on screen or anything, and that will be true of our future polls as well, so we'll be able to share that for you momentarily.
And just as a hint, this is probably the easiest of the poll questions, so we thought we'd get started with an easy one. What is ethics? How would you define ethics choosing from these 3 different definitions? All right, so we see the poll results. So the answer from my end is that all 3 phrases are actually legitimate definitions of ethics. The first phrase emphasizes moral principles, and a third of you chose that definition, that moral principles, ethics is moral principles that govern a person's or a group's behavior. The second definition reminds us that ethics is more than what we say, it's actually what we do. And that definition was the decisions, choices, and actions that reflect our values. Only 8% of you chose that as the preferred definition. Then the third definition suggests that our decisions and actions are guided by our values. It's interesting to see that 2/3 of the participants in today's webinar chose that third definition that really relates decisions and actions to our values. So the bottom line is that all 3 are actual published definitions of ethics. I didn't make these up, but it seems like the group on the call today really gravitate to the third one as your first choice and the first one as the second choice. So good job with the poll. And as I said, they're going to get a little bit harder as we go along. All right, now I want to talk about how leaders can embed strong ethics in an organizational setting. So there are 2 very common approaches to doing this. The first is to adopt a code of ethics or perhaps a code of conduct, and then make sure that your staff are held accountable to that code. So what does accountability mean? So the essence, if you will, of accountability is doing what you say you are going to do. Living up to your promises. In the nonprofit sector, we hear that word accountability all the time, and yet many of us don't take the time to stop and think and reflect and actually define it. But that word accountability is very powerful. It's doing what you say you're going to do. So many nonprofit organizations, and that includes many community action agencies, use a published code of conduct, a written code of conduct, as a way to explain and really codify their ethical principles and expectations. But I'm wondering, have you ever worked in an organization where some employees ignore the rules that are found in your written policies? The truth is that most of us have. And across America, there are many organizations that have developed terrific written policies that are ignored by either a small percentage of the workforce or even, in some cases, a significant percentage of the workforce. And in some cases, and I've seen this in many nonprofits, when policies are ignored, when that written code of conduct is not followed, leadership, instead of fixing the code of conduct or trying a different method to convey those important ideas, what leaders sometimes do is just add to the code of conduct, add to the policies, create more policies on top of policies. So they lengthen that document that has already been ignored. So one of the common challenges that we face when we're drafting policies and implementing policies is that we need to make language simple enough so that everybody in the organization will not only understand what we mean, but how to follow that policy. But that's the first approach. Adopt a code of conduct and hold your staff accountable. It's easy to say, it's hard to do. The second approach is to use stories and scenarios to explain what you mean by ethical conduct. What are you talking about exactly when you use the term ethical conduct or ethics in the workplace? So research shows us that the human brain is more active when we hear a story. So when you're listening to a presentation such as this one, 2 parts of your brain are activated. And what's happening is that the language processing function in your brain is decoding my words into meaning. But that's about it. That's all that's happening. But if I were to tell you a story, additional parts of the brain, additional centers in your brain, including your sensory cortex and even your motor cortex, would become active. And so the bottom line is that a story about ethical or unethical conduct can actually put your entire brain to work. But I wanted to just let you know that there are these two ways to teach and embed these ethical principles in your organization. The first is through those written policies, which I know you're familiar with, and the second is through storytelling. And of course, you might want to consider doing both. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the relationship between compliance and ethics. So I love the quote that is appearing on the current slide. Compliance is avoiding a behavior for fear of punishment. Do you agree with that? We work with so many leaders that are interested in compliance issues and ensuring that their organizations are compliant. I think this quote is very true. Compliance is basically about doing what's required and what's necessary. It's what you must do to avoid getting into trouble. But ethics is something different. Ethics is about doing what's right. So another point that's made in a quote on this slide is that while compliance may be assigned to one person in an organization, making ethical decisions is something that is really the entire organization's responsibility. So if most employees in your agency are ethical, but one person is not, is the organization ethical? I hope you'll agree with me that the answer is probably not. Another way to think about this difference between compliance and ethics is something that one of my staff brought up. She said, you know what, when you think about compliance, you're thinking about external forces and external pressure to do something. You're required to do something per some regulatory agency, per some external agency's mandate. But she said ethics is kind of internal. It's what the organization decides to do, how it decides to do business. So I think that's an interesting way to contrast compliance and ethics. Now I want us to think about ethics, culture, and reputation risk, kind of the intersection between these three different concepts. Many community action leaders that I've met over the years would agree with me that reputation risk and culture are both very important to the success of the community action movement. Some of you may have heard the expression, culture trumps strategy. Well, what that means is that culture, more so than any clear strategy or tactics, actually determines what gets done in an organization. And I think the same is true with ethical conduct. Your agency could have a very clear ethics policy, but if your key employees or your leadership team openly violate the rules in that policy, other employees may follow suit. And that becomes part of the culture of the organization, how people behave. And the question would be, why should I follow the rules if I'm noticing that my boss or my coworkers aren't doing so? Now I want to spend a few minutes talking about the findings from a very interesting study on ethics and different generations of employees. And this is called, the study is called Generational Differences in Workplace Ethics, a supplemental report of the 2011 National Business Ethics Survey. And it was published by the Ethics Resource Center. And you can find the study at the link indicated on the slide, but you can also find it pretty easily at ethics.org. And that's the homepage of the Ethics Resource Center. So I want us to think about this issue. Are there differences in how young versus older staff approach ethical issues? So the findings are in the study that I just mentioned. They do suggest that there are some subtle differences. And one interesting difference has to do with the pressure to compromise your standards, your personal standards. And what the study suggests is that younger employees, and those younger employees tend to be newer members of the team, of your staff team, may be more likely to succumb to pressure to compromise their ethical standards. So we're going to take a look at an example of how this might actually happen in our next scenario. I'm calling this one scenario number 1. And for this scenario, we're actually going to use another poll. So we'll have a poll coming up. So here's the scenario. One of your tasks at a brand new job is to send longtime donors a letter asking them to contribute additional money. This morning, your boss gives you a draft letter describing some of the agency's accomplishments during the past year. In your opinion, though, one of the accomplishments is a huge exaggeration and 2 others are questionable. So I'm asking you to put yourself in the shoes of that new employee. You are the brand new employee working at a community action agency, and you've been given this assignment to send out an appeal letter asking people to contribute money to the organization. And you're looking over the draft, and you're pretty certain that one of the accomplishments is a huge exaggeration and 2 others are questionable. So what would your new employee do? You put yourself in the shoes of that new employee and imagine what you would do, but what do you think somebody reporting to you would do under the same set of circumstances? So let's go ahead and pull up that poll and look at those options. So again, I want you to answer this question based on what you think your new employee would do. The first one is tweak but not change the letter out of respect for me because, you know, I've been here a long time and people respect me and my judgment is respected. Number 2 is I would think an employee would immediately suggest changing the letter to make it accurate with no exaggerations. Even one of my brand new staff knows that everybody has an obligation to speak up or speak the truth, even if it means questioning the authority of the CEO of the agency. And choose option number C, or letter number C, the third one, if you really don't know how that new employee would respond in this particular scenario. So you're putting you're guessing what that new employee would do, brand new employee at your community action agency. So we've got a few seconds left before the poll closes, and then we'll find out how you respond, what your prediction is with respect to what a new employee would do under this set of circumstances.
All right, that poll is closed. We'll be able to get our results here momentarily for discussion.
All right, great. So we can see the poll results. So very interesting. More than half of you, 64%, feel that new employee, even though they're brand new to the agency, would immediately suggest changing the letter to make it accurate with no exaggerations, because even those brand new employees know that they have an obligation to speak up. And so that's a very confident response on your part, that somebody who's brand new would risk offending someone in authority by pointing out some mistakes in a letter. And that suggests, you know, that you feel confident your organization has a very high ethical culture, if you will. 18% of you said, you know, that employee is probably going to tweak the letter out of respect for me. And then 18% of you very candid in saying that I don't know how that new person would react. And, you know, it's interesting, this scenario is one that we came up with here at the Nonprofit Risk Management Center, and I have an incredible team, a small team of professionals with, I think, very high standards, and I asked them this question as well. If this were you, what would you do? And 2 of my staff said, you know, I would probably tweak to be candid and honest with you, Melanie, I would tweak the letter, but I wouldn't, you know, come back to you and say this is an exaggeration, this is wrong, because I respect you, because I'm brand new. I don't quite know how we operate around here, and I may think it's an exaggeration, but I might be hesitant to bring that up, you know, in my first month of employment. All right, let's talk a little bit more about younger versus older staff. Then I want to share a couple of the recommendations from that report that I mentioned. In that study, the authors mention that younger workers tend to be influenced by social interactions with their peer groups and others, that they're more influenced by those social interactions than perhaps older workers. They said that older workers tend to be influenced more by respect for the hierarchy of the organization, by the structure of the organization, and by loyalty, and tend to really place a high value in being loyal to the mission of the organization. All right, let's talk about culture's connection to ethics, and then I want to share a couple of those recommendations from that study. So culture, it turns out, is important to all generations of staff. But with younger workers, culture is described as kind of the sum of their interactions with many different individuals, including their peers and their coworkers, whereas older workers tend to, according to this recent study, older workers tend to perceive culture based on stated values, the tone from the top, the organization's published values and statements about what it believes in. So I would encourage you to take a look at that study. Some of you may agree or disagree with the findings, but there's some interesting insights looking at, are there differences in perceptions of ethics and ethical decision-making between younger and older workers. And the fact is that each of our agencies has multiple generations of workers, staff at any given time. Some of us employ 2 or 3 different generations, and some employ as many as 4 or 5. So let me just highlight 3 of the recommendations from that particular research. Under the category of millennials, so what do you do with respect to encouraging ethical conduct on the part of millennial workers? One of the recommendations was to focus on messaging from colleagues and immediate supervisors, those who are more local, right, closer to those millennial workers and more likely to be influential to them. So this is the idea that millennial workers tend to be more influenced by peers, people in their closer to them in the organizational structure. And then a recommendation under the list of items to think about for Generation Xers is to make advice and standards easily accessible when facing an ethical dilemma. Generation Xers' ability to review codes of conduct and standards will make a big difference in how they handle the situation in front of them. And then in the section of the report that talks about baby boomers and traditionalists, there are 2 recommendations I want to highlight. One is focus on messaging from the hierarchy above this generation, right? So from the senior leadership team in the organization. And the second is to communicate that when employees report misconduct, they'll be protected and informed throughout the process. So assure those baby boomers rather and traditionalists that they will be protected should they report misconduct. All right, the chart in front of us on slide number 14 is also from the Ethics Resource Center, and it appears in the National Business Ethics Survey. And what this chart does is it contrasts 2 ethical measures over a 13-year period, so from the year 2000 to 2013. And the measures are, 1, observed misconduct in the previous 12 months, which is shown by the red line, and then the second is a sense of pressure to compromise standards, and that's depicted by that orange line, the lower line of the 2. So as you'll see, as you look at this chart, the percentage of employees who observed misconduct in 2000 was 51%, and 41% in 2013. So it declined by 10% between 2000 and 2013. And then the percentage of employees who felt pressure to compromise standards was 14% in 2000 and then 9% in 2013. So this particular chart and these 2 measures suggest that there's been an improvement in workplace ethics between the years that, the bookend years when this survey was conducted. So we've looked at 2 indicators that there has been some progress, if you will, or there's good news when it comes to ethics in the workplace, but that Ethics Resource Study, or Ethics Resource Center study, also offers some sobering news. And the not so good news is that, according to the survey, a relatively high percentage of misconduct is committed by managers. And of course, the irony in this finding is that managers are the very people who are supposed to set a good example of ethical conduct and make sure that employees honor the organization's rules. So that's kind of an unfortunate finding. So along with the good news, there's some bad news. So the chart on page 16, or slide number 16, shows breakdown of misconduct committed by different types of managers in an organization. And again, this chart is based on the National Business Ethics Survey. So as you'll see, survey participants said that 24% of misconduct was committed by senior leaders and 19% of misconduct was committed by middle managers. So if you step back, and sometimes you look at a chart like this and it's hard to quite figure out the message that it's sending you, but if you step back for a minute and reflect on this pie chart, and consider the fact that most organizations have far more non-management staff than managers, the numbers on this chart are pretty troubling. It looks like a significant percentage of misconduct is conducted by managers, even though, in all likelihood, they represent a small part of the total workforce in any organization, and certainly including in organizations that were represented in this particular survey. All right, now we're going to turn our attention to organization-wide misconduct. And the fact is that in some cases, ethical misconduct really isn't limited to one person or one group within an organization. It permeates the culture. In that National Business Ethics Survey, the authors describe several forms of what they call organization-wide misconduct. And what I've done here is I've picked a few to display. I picked 4 examples, but I highlighted one, and it's the 4th bullet point on this slide. And that's violating employee benefits, wage, or overtime rules. And I highlighted this particular one because my sense is that this is the form of organization-wide misconduct that's most likely to occur in nonprofit organizations, including community action. So my sense is that the other forms are less likely to occur, very rare in the nonprofit world, but I think that 4th example is something that's probably happening more than we'd like to admit in the nonprofit sector. All right, we're going to turn our attention to ethical dilemma number 2. So here is, let me read this one for those who are just listening by telephone. During a recent board meeting, CEO Bob is reminded of the importance of keeping overhead costs low. When he returns to his office, he begins thinking of ways to allocate overhead costs to the agency's funded projects. By the time the next quarterly reports are issued, pure overhead expense is reduced to a mere 5%. That's our ethical dilemma number 2. So now let's go ahead and do another poll and find out what you think about this particular ethical issue. So you've got 4 options. The first one is, Bob is a hero. Potential donors will feel so much more confident now that overhead costs are low. The second option is, Bob pulled a fast one. What he did is potentially misleading to donors and the board. Overhead costs haven't really gone down. They've simply been hidden in funded projects. The third option is, Bob should be ashamed. Overhead is overhead and should never be hidden or confused with true project costs. And the 4th option is, I really don't know. So you've got another 20 seconds to reply to this scenario and choose one of those options. We've really got some extreme reactions in this particular scenario. So just a few seconds left.
All right, that poll is closed. We are compiling the results, and we'll be able to share for discussion momentarily.
All right, great. So interesting results. This is a tough question. It's a tough issue because for many years, our nonprofit sector has been under a lot of pressure to spend a greater percentage of revenue on programs versus overhead. We've basically been taught that overhead is a dirty word, that it's something that, you know, is not related to serving people and improving communities, and so we should spend as little as possible on overhead. However, in recent years, several national groups have started advancing the idea that the percentage of money spent on overhead is not a compelling indicator of the effectiveness of a nonprofit, and that's really changing the whole story about overhead. So in response to this poll question, 50% of you said Bob pulled a fast one. What he's done is potentially misleading, and because overhead costs haven't really gone down, they've simply been hidden in funded projects. 20% of you said Bob should be ashamed. Overhead is overhead, and it should never be hidden or confused. So those of you who responded that way feel, 1/5 of the group today feel this is not a good thing. This is a terrible thing that he's done. And then 30% of you said, I don't know. And I think these are interesting results, and I really commend those who said, I don't know, because this is a tricky question. You know, the fact is that for years we've been told we shouldn't spend money on overhead, we should reduce overhead, and many people in the sector who were getting that message said, you know what, I just need to figure out how to allocate overhead. And so thousands of organizations have allocated overhead in a way that reduces the amount that appears as pure overhead. And I would say there are a lot of leaders in our community that would say that's not unethical at all. That's the appropriate thing to do if we're being measured against how much we spend on overhead, to really allocate things like rent and utilities and office supplies, to allocate those to those programs that we run, because without those overhead items, without renting space, without paying for office supplies, et cetera, without paying the utility bills, we couldn't offer those programs. So it's an interesting issue, but I love this ethical dilemma because I think there's a lot more gray than black and white. All right, we're going to go straight into ethical dilemma number 3, quite a bit different from the others, and I'll read this one as well. So a project manager tells the CEO of a community action agency that injury rates in her program seem to be higher than ever before. The program serves people in need, but several clients have been injured while receiving services, and things seem to be getting worse. Now, the program has just been approved for additional grant funding. The funder, though, is unaware of these recent injuries. So the issues to think about in this ethical dilemma include: what obligation does the CEO have to address the safety issue? Does the project manager or CEO have an obligation to tell the funder that this program, although it may be successful in some measures, by some measures, it's actually resulted in injuries as well? And then another issue is, what is the risk if it turns out that the project manager is wrong? So for this particular poll, I want to ask you, what would you do? I want you to choose the option that is your gut feeling about what you would do under this set of circumstances. So the first option is investigate the safety issues, but allow the program to continue. Option B is temporarily suspend the program while I look into the safety issues. Option C is brief the board and the funder and ask for their thoughts and recommendations. Option D is work on an action plan to improve safety, but wait to tell the board and maybe wait to tell the funder until that plan is ready for prime time. And option E is something else. So we've got about 33 seconds left for you to answer that poll, and then we'll talk about it.
Great, those responses are coming in. We do have about 10 more seconds to put your answers in. All right, the poll is closed, and we are able to share those out.
Great. All right. Well, thank you. Interesting. So we have votes in each of the 5 answer categories. Nearly half of you chose investigate the safety issues, but allow the program to continue. And that's a really interesting option because that suggests that you're committed to safety and you're interested in addressing a potential downside risk in a program, but you also understand that the program is serving people in need and you're balancing kind of risk and reward in your management of that particular program. 8%, so just a very small percentage of you said, I would stop the program while I look into the safety issues. So again, you're seeing that those potential safety issues really eclipse the benefit of the program continuing. And the ethical approach is to stop and prevent any further injuries before anyone else gets hurt. So 15% of you said you would talk to your board and potential funder, potentially the funder as well, and ask for their thoughts on what to do. And it's an interesting choice because one of the things we learn as CEOs of nonprofit organizations is that, the CEO's job, the staff's job is to manage operations, manage the day-to-day operations of an organization, and the board's job is to be strategic and provide, the direction of the organization and long-term view. And one of the things I've seen time and time again is that when we ask our board for operational recommendations, we're inviting them into operations when we've, in a previous opportunity told them to stay out of operations and be strategic. Once you invite the board in to offer recommendations about operations, you better be prepared to follow those recommendations. It's very hard to ask the board for their recommendations and then say, you know what, I thought about it, I'm going to go my own way. The fourth option was work on an action plan to improve safety, but wait to tell the board until that plan is ready. 23% of you, so almost 25%, almost a quarter of you said that's what you would do. That's an interesting option, and that's what a lot of CEOs actually do in managing their organizations, is that when a problem arises, we want to fix the problem, but we don't want to tell the board about the problem until we have a plan in place. And sometimes that's a good thing, and it increases the confidence that the board has in our leadership, and sometimes that can backfire on us. If we wait too long to tell the board, if we're waiting to put that plan together and we wait too long to tell our board, the board may feel that we were hiding something from them and that we should have let them know about it earlier, particularly if that problem escalates and becomes a crisis. So in this case, in this scenario, were these safety issues to become serious while we're working on that action plan, and perhaps there was a client died or suffered a really serious injury, the board might be upset with us that we waited to let them know about the problem until after we had a solution. And then 8% of you said, I might do something else altogether. So that shows that you've got your thinking caps on, your creative thinking caps on, and you can see even other additional alternatives to the ones that I've presented. And I chose these ethical dilemmas because they're not easy. I don't think they're easy answers to any of them. And again, it's to really illustrate the fact that it's hard to sort through ethical challenges facing our agencies. All right, let's look at number 4. I think this is our last ethical dilemma before we turn our attention to the subject of an ethics filter. So here we go with ethical dilemma number 4, and we'll do a poll. Since your most recent performance review, you're feeling really good about your relationship with the board of directors. But a week later, the chair of your personnel committee calls with a special request. Her cousin Sam recently missed the deadline for utility bill assistance from your community action agency. And that the chair of that committee wants to know, is there any wiggle room? Could you help her cousin this one time and let him get that assistance even though the deadline has passed? So I want you to answer this based on what you would do under the circumstances. And some of you are thinking, oh, this is an easy one. This is not an easy one. And I want you to really think about what you would do if a member of your board called and asked you for this special favor, extend the deadline for one of their family members. What would you really do? So let's be honest, it's anonymous. You get to share your answer, and Cashin and I can't see how you answer, but I think this one's a little bit harder than it looks at first. So the options are, A, cut cousin Sam some slack, but allow other latecomers to receive utility bill assistance as well. Option B is call the board chair and ask her what to do. Option C is send an email to the entire board explaining the committee chair's request and ask the board, what should I do? Option D is explain that you're sorry, but the utility bill assistance program has a strict deadline and it's just too late for cousin Sam. And option E is something else.
All right, that poll is closing. There were a few people that were in process, so we'll try to capture those as we get these compiled, so we'll be able to share momentarily.
All right. Really interesting. So 90% of you said, explain that you're sorry, but the utility bill assistance program has a strict deadline and it's simply too late for cousin Sam. So you're drawing a really hard line between doing what's, you know, you're not going to make exceptions even though a board member has asked you to do so. And then 10% of you said, call the board chair and ask her what to do. I think that's an interesting choice because you may wind up doing exactly what the rest of the group said, which is to say you're sorry, but the program has a strict deadline. But maybe those of you who chose option B were thinking, let me let my board chair know. My board chair should probably know that a member of the team, the leadership team, has asked for this special exception, has asked for a special favor, which is really not a good thing for a board member to do. And the board chair may encourage you and support you in calling up the board member and saying, I'm sorry, but we just can't make exceptions. It's simply too late. But that way it puts the board chair on notice that a member of the board has done that. And maybe this issue needs to be part of your board orientation or your ongoing board training or some discussion in the future. This is an interesting scenario for another reason in that I don't think it's terribly unusual for a member of a board to ask for a special favor. And I know in my own personal experience, I've served on quite a few boards. The one example I have of special favors was I served at one time on the board of a private school. And I understood from the CEO of the school that from time to time parents would call and ask for special favors. So a classic example would be, my child is going into 3rd grade. Would you please make sure that she has homeroom teacher A versus B? She doesn't like homeroom teacher B. Could you please put her in teacher A's classroom? And the CEO of the school used to say to me, it's so hard because we have to make decisions based on what's in the best interest of the school and the kids. And when parents call us for favors, it's very hard to turn them away because they're not only parents of our kids, but they're also funders in that they pay tuition checks. They write checks for school tuition. And, of course, this issue was even harder to deal with for the CEO when it was a member of the board calling to ask that his or her child be placed in a particular classroom, because not only are they a customer of the school, but they're also the CEO or the headmaster supervisor as well. So this does happen from time to time. And something else I want to point out, I think that sometimes when board members ask for special favors, they don't even realize that they're putting you in a tough position, that they're putting you in a really difficult position, and they're asking for something that you shouldn't have to cave into, or they shouldn't be asking in the first place. All right, let's go ahead and talk about why we need an ethics filter. So why do we need a filter? So I think there are 3 reasons why an ethics filter can be really valuable. So the first one is doing the right thing may not always be easy or obvious. And think about some of the dilemmas we've reviewed today using the polling feature. So many decisions we make depend on the circumstances at hand. And some of these circumstances create what we refer to as the gray area. It's somewhere between black and white. So I want you to remember for a minute the plot of the novel Les Miserables. So the story, for those of you that have read the book or seen the film or seen the Broadway show, the story begins when the protagonist, Jean Valjean, is released from prison after serving time for stealing bread for his starving sister and her family. So apparently in the story, the way the story goes, he served, I believe, 5 years for stealing the bread, and then he served additional time for trying to escape from prison. So most of us would say stealing is wrong, and some of us would say stealing is always wrong. And yet when we read Les Miserables or we see the show or the film, most of us sympathize with the protagonist because of the circumstances at hand. So the circumstances at hand come into play when we make decisions, when we make choices that have ethical implications. A second reason we need an ethics filter is that no 2 people see ethical issues the same way. Something you believe is wrong may be described differently or thought of very differently by somebody seated in the office next door to you. So even somebody from the same generation may see an ethical dilemma differently than you. And then the third reason I think an ethics filter can be very helpful is that ethical decision-making is linked to the reputation of your organization. Your good reputation is an asset that you really need to protect. So I think for those reasons, an ethics filter, some sort of tool that we can turn to and kind of filter ethical issues through, may help us make the best possible decisions under the circumstances. So this next slide, slide number 25, shows what I'm calling a sample ethics filter. So if you're considering a decision and you're not quite sure if it's the right thing to do, again, ethics is about doing the right thing, not necessarily what's required, you want to ask a series of questions. The first one is it legal? The second question is it fair? And the third one is it honest? So you want to start by asking those questions about a decision that you need to make. Ask those questions from your perspective or in your opinion, and that's what that second column in the box is for. Is it legal? In my opinion, if my answer is yes, I would either put a little tick box, a tick mark, or an X, or the word yes. Is it fair? Is it honest? So I want to put those in my opinion ideas, record those in the box. Next, I want you to put yourself in the shoes of your supervisor. What would my boss do? Would my boss think it's legal? Would my boss think it's fair? would my boss think it's honest? And then the third step is to say, let me put myself in the shoes of a stakeholder of this community action agency, perhaps a client, a funder, a board member, or somebody else who has a different point of view, a different vantage point. Would they think it was legal? Would they think it was fair? Would they think it was honest? And then use that final column to really tally up the results. If you're saying yes, 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 yes across the board, then it has survived, the issue at hand has survived this ethics filter, and it seems to be the right thing to do. If you've got 2 no's and a yes under any of these questions, is it legal, is it fair, is it honest, then the right course might be to say no, to not take that action that you're giving consideration to. So that's kind of a simple ethics filter. And then I wanted to add a little bit more complexity to it and kind of help you go beyond a basic filter and add some additional questions to the mix. So the 4 questions that appear at the bottom of the slide are those additional questions that really add a little bit more complexity to the filter. One is, am I willing to take the risk? And another way to phrase that would be, am I willing to live with the consequences? If this goes wrong, if this goes right. Another great question for your filter is, do I have enough information? Do I know enough about the situation to make the right decision? Again, not the required decision, but the right decision. And then the third question is, how would I feel if I had to defend this decision on the evening news? Right? If I were called by the media tomorrow and they wanted to know, why did you do this? How would I feel about that? Would I be completely comfortable, or would I be uncomfortable? And if you'd be very comfortable, then it's probably the right decision. If you'd be very uncomfortable or slightly uncomfortable, it might be the wrong decision. And then the last question in this filter I think is very powerful, and that is, have I considered dissenting views? Have I thought of different ways to do this? I've got a question in front of me. I've got a decision to be made. I'm not quite sure what's right, what's the right thing to do, what's the ethical thing to do. Have I thought about contrary views? Or another way to think about this question is there a different way to achieve the same result that might be more appropriate and feel better and be perceived as and be more ethical? So that's the ethics filter, and I hope it's helpful. Again, we have kind of a simplistic one with those 3 basic questions, and then those additional 4 questions to add if you want to challenge yourself and really kind of go through those additional issues and give some additional consideration to the decision before you actually make it. Okay, so we're now on slide number 26. And I wanted to share on this slide 4 factors that influence ethical conduct. And these factors were described in a terrific article that was featured in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And the factors are moral awareness, moral decision-making, moral intent, and moral action. I actually think these factors are really steps we go through when we try to make ethical decisions. So the first one has to do with recognizing that a decision we're about to make has an ethical component to it. And you've all heard the expression, you can't fix something that's wrong unless you recognize you've got a problem. And that's really what this is about, that we're tuned into the fact that there are ethical issues associated with the decision. And then the second factor is this idea of moral decision-making. What course of action is ethically sound? And I think for this part of the process, or this step in the process, that ethics filter may be helpful. Moral intent, what values should take priority in the decision? And I think in order to take this step, or appreciate this factor, if you will, you've got to recognize your own kind of ethical core, your own values, but you've also need to have a really clear understanding of the values of the organization as a whole. What does this agency stand for? What are we all about? How do we do business? How do we want to be known? What's our reputation? And then the 4th factor is following through on ethical decisions, or what the authors called moral action. And this may include not only making the decision, but also standing by the decision, being willing to defend the decision that you made, which may be unpopular, but maybe grounded in those core values and the ethics of your organization. and your commitment to really operating on an ethical basis or an ethical foundation. So following through, I think that follow-through can be difficult in some instances, but it's what leaders do every day, right? We make decisions, and we were thoughtful in making decisions. We understand the basis for making those decisions. We look for dissenting views. We seek contrary points of view. We're not taking a poll every day and going with the majority view. And ultimately, kind of in a big picture, high-level perspective, we're each and every day trying to do what's right. Not what's easiest, not what's simplest, not what's cheapest, but to do what's right. And I think that really is the essence of ethical conduct, is doing what's right. So this next slide, slide 27, lists 3 of the resources I've mentioned: that National Business Ethics Survey at the bottom, that Stanford Social Innovation Review article at the top, and also the website of the Ethics Resource Center, which is ethics.org. All terrific resources. You can also find that study on generational differences in workplace ethics at ethics.org. You can search for it there, and it should be very easy to find. And if you have difficulty finding any of these resources, please don't hesitate to let me know, to reach out to me. I'd be happy to send you links to them directly. 2 other resources I just wanted to mention briefly are the website nonprofitrisk.org/CAP, and that's the risk management portal that was developed for the Community Action Partnership, mentioned by Cashin at the beginning of the program. 2 different tools located on that website: My Risk Management Policies and My Risk Assessment, and also a book by the Nonprofit Risk Management Center called Exposed, a legal field guide for nonprofit executives. So 2 other resources that you might want to consider as you think about ethical issues and risk issues facing your organization. So that's it for my slides. I'm absolutely happy to take questions. Looks like we had 1 question, and I'm just I haven't been able to pull up the question. So, Cashin, I don't know if you can read that question to me, or we'll see if there are other questions as well.
Actually, I believe it was a technical question on that about the webinar. We'll give a minute in case there are questions bubbling to the surface that are in process there. Did want to remind everybody that today's presentation is recorded, so you will be able to go back through this, or if you missed part of it. We will also have the slides so you can get another look at some of those great resources that Melanie put up a moment ago. And of course, last but not least, don't let this be the end of the conversation. Do reach out to Melanie directly. Her contact information is on the slides, or if you want, you can also come to the partnership. We'll answer if possible, or kind of be your liaison over to Melanie if it's something that we think she would be better suited to answer.
Sure. So, and I'll just say that, sometimes particularly ethical issues and tough risk issues are ones that you'd prefer to ask kind of one-on-one. And another reason why we offer free risk help to our members, including community action agencies, is that we know that for each question you have, there are a lot of circumstances and details that it's hard to answer if the question is posed in 1 sentence. You really need to give us a little bit of the backstory, some of that background. So please don't hesitate to contact me by email. Our telephone number is 703-777-3504. We welcome your questions. We're happy to brainstorm with you on the telephone, think about your situation, and really try to give you an answer that really suits your circumstances and constraints and fits your culture and really is the right answer for you. And if we don't know the answer, we'd love to do research and try to figure that out and work with you to share those findings. So happy to hear from you after the program. Thanks so much to everybody who joined today. Thanks for your interest in this subject, and I hope I will hear from you by telephone or by email or see you at a future Community Action Conference.
All right, so I don't see any other questions that have come in, so we will go ahead and close up today's event. Thank you, everyone, for your attendance and attention today, for participating in those polls so that we could have a little bit of discussion, even in this kind of web format. And last but not least, there will be a survey that comes up at the end of this event, so you can tell us what you thought about today's event, what can we do to be better, and what other kinds of topics would you like to see from the Community Action Partnership. So appreciate your participation in that as well. So have a great afternoon. Thank you, everyone.